introduce Jon Meacham. He is the author of American Lion, Andrew Jackson in the White House, and he is also the editor of Newsweek, covering politics, international affairs, and breaking news. John's newest book was actually nominated one of the New York Times notable books of 2008 just a couple days ago. So congratulations on that. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jon Meacham.
It's very generous of you all to allow an old media person into the actual sanctum sanctorum. It's a sign of your ecumenical instincts, and I think that should be applauded. I'm delighted to be here to talk about Jackson. Was going to just run through what I think is important about him, and then if you all have any questions, would love to talk about that. There is a few things going on, as you all know, in Washington that are of interest, and I guess Chicago actually is of more interest at this point. But the wonderful thing about Andrew Jackson, and I spent 5 years with him, which was probably more time than any other person except his wife spent actually in close contact, is he really made the modern presidency. His office is the one that Senator Obama is going to take up in January. He developed the powers, he developed a lot of the virtues, and he planted the seeds for a lot of the vices as well. I wrote this book because I think that we can't simply celebrate people in the past who are uncomplicated. Jackson is a key player in the twin tragedies of American life, slavery and Indian removal, Native American removal. And I was drawn to him because of the contradictions and the complexities of his character. Here's a man who could expand the possibilities of democracy farther than the Founding Fathers ever really dreamt of in terms of a democratic instinct, and yet he was an unrepentant slaveholder. He was a man who could create the means of mass democracy that we see even now, and yet he masterminded the removal of Indian tribes. The competing instincts of grace and rage, of light and dark, of kindness and cruelty, I think are national contradictions as well as personal ones. His sins are our sins. He represents the best of us and the worst of us, often in very vivid and bold or larger-than-life colors. But he was a figure who embodied the nation's contradictions in a way that I think is true even now. We are willing to live with all kinds of equalities and injustices at this hour that could ultimately, and he said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Thank you. Even now, we are willing to live with things that a generation ahead may look back and say, exactly how did you not think health coverage, health care was a human right? One generation's unacknowledged question is the next generation's clear evil, and I think that's an important point to remember. When Jackson was a young boy, one of the neighborhood kids said, later in life, he said, you know, you could wrestle with Andy, and I'd throw him once, and I'd throw him twice, and I'd throw him 3 times, but Andy would never stay throwed. And Andrew Jackson never did stay throwed. The human drama of this man, the first self-made man to become president of the United States, begins in South Carolina, in this little pocket between North and South Carolina. He never knew his father, which puts him in an interesting presidential category. Basically, most presidents either have a very, very strong father figure in their lives or no father at all. If perchance you are trying to raise a normal child, they have no hope of becoming president of the United States. Jackson never knew his father. President Ford never knew his father. President Clinton never knew his father. President-elect Obama never knew his father. Adams, Kennedy, Bush, McCain are all on the other side of that. Jackson's childhood, it would have challenged, if Dickens had written Louis L'Amour westerns, it would have challenged the fictionalization. He grew up at the time of the Revolution, at a time when there was ferocious civil combat in the neighborhoods in South Carolina. We tend to think of the Revolution as Saratoga, the Delaware, Valley Forge, and all that's true, but there was ferocious combat in the South, hand to hand in some cases. And Jackson lost his mother and his two brothers in that conflict. So he was completely alone in the world by the time he was 14 years old. He was what we would call today a troubled teen. He had many issues. It would take Dr. Phil a long time to figure out what to do with Andrew Jackson. I think he built, in the absence of a father and then ultimately the absence of a family altogether, he built a universe for himself in which he was always self-reliant because he had seen that and experienced that no one else was ultimately reliable, that everyone could be taken away, everyone could die, and so he would always rely on himself. I had a conversation with Senator Obama in August about these same issues involving his father, and the senator's line, which was quite to the point, was that by not knowing his father, Obama, had to learn how to raise himself. And I think you see that with lots of people who rise to positions of great power. There are people who are able to draw supporters in, who are able to inspire confidence, but who are always ready when the crisis comes to take care of things on their own. And Jackson was clearly part of that. Another important point for what ultimately he did for the country is he tended to see America as his family. And the language I'm about to use, I use quite deliberately. He believed that his family's blood had consecrated the Union, had made it sacred, something set apart. Because, again, having come out of the Revolution, when he was 13 years old, he was a prisoner of war briefly, and a British officer ordered young Jackson to polish his boots, and Jackson refused. And so the British officer hit him over the head with a saber and left a scar the length and width of a man's finger in Jackson's head. It was later remarked that we were unclear whether that British officer really thought that was a brilliant move after the Battle of New Orleans, which Jackson won and expelled the British from the continent for the foreseeable future. The country became his kith and kin, and he said, "We are one great family." In this instinct for union, you see the beginnings of what Lincoln did in a very important way. And without that, I think without that emotional reaction to the country, we would have had a very different 19th century in American history. He rose from nothing. He fought his way up. He became a lawyer. He spent very little formal time in school. In fact, the most sustained period of time I can figure out that he ever sat in one place was in the Presbyterian Meeting House in South Carolina. And I don't know if any of you all are Presbyterians, but boy, when they went to church, they went to church. And it lasted longer than Jesus was on the cross. I mean, it just went on and on and on in the 19th century, and maybe in the 18th century, and maybe even still now. I'm an Episcopalian, which is sort of like being Presbyterian without actually having to worry about the Bible. It's a very good middle course if you're interested. But he had an interest in the catechism. His rhetoric later in life, he would ask a question and answer it in catechism form. And under stress, he would almost always revert to scriptural imagery. So Henry Clay, his great enemy from Kentucky, wasn't a scoundrel. He was the Judas of the West, and his end would be the same, as Jackson put it. He talked about David mourning for Absalom. It was very much the great stories of the Bible were what was in his head. There are two other important books for him. One was The Scottish Chiefs, which we now know as Braveheart, basically. And that story of a colonial figure rising up against English tyranny was a dramatic movie that unfolded in Jackson's head. And the third was a book which has fallen into obscurity, but it was very important at the time, called Lord Chesterfield's Letters. It was a kind of a manners manual, and not just in terms of which fork to use, but how do you, if you are a self-made man in that world, how do you present yourself as you try to move forward in more cultivated society than perhaps you would have been born to. A key Chesterfield principle was have apparent confidence in all, real confidence in none. Have apparent confidence in all, real confidence in none. It's a particularly interesting insight for someone who went into politics. And again, goes back to the self-reliance theme, that Jackson always, in the end, knew that he could pull things together. We might as well go ahead and just talk about sex now, having been very high-minded for a minute. Jackson's life was shaped by sexual scandal. First, in terms of his marriage, he had fallen deeply in love with a woman named Rachel Donaldson Robards. There was one small problem. There was a Mr. Robards. And Jackson precipitated, I think it's safe to say, a divorce. They were separated. According to later accounts, they believed the divorce was final. Jackson went off and got married to Rachel. It turned out the divorce had not been granted. And so for the rest of her life and Jackson's life, his political foes would refer to his wife as a bigamist and a whore. And quite openly, it was an early example of dirty campaigning. I know Karl Rove wants credit for inventing all of this, but actually it does predate the 2000 campaign. Jackson believed that the cumulative stress of those attacks ultimately killed Rachel. Roughly at this point in the transition between the election and the inauguration. She collapsed in Nashville at their home and died, buried on Christmas Eve, 1828. He was devastated, spent the rest of his life sleeping with her miniature propped up against her little book of Isaac Watts's translation of the Psalms, and always believed that his enemies had killed his wife. And that was not good news for his enemies, as you might imagine. He was radicalized, and there are really two great contributions, I think, to ascribe to him, and then two great negative things to very dark and troubling legacies that have to be explored as well. One is the salvation of the Union during an early crisis with South Carolina in 1832-33. Now, I know I don't want to get you all too excited, but I know when you hear the phrase nullification crisis, it just makes your heart beat a little faster. But try to control yourselves because you're adults now. It is a terrible word, nullification, because it sounds so goddamn boring. But it isn't. It is an important skirmish. It was an important prologue and prelude to the Civil War. South Carolina, which always causes most of the problems in the world. I'm a Tennessean, I can say that. South Carolinians tend to start wars that Tennesseans have to fight, which I say a lot, particularly in South Carolina. Wanted the right to nullify, to declare null and void different federal laws. The pretext, the occasion for this argument about having a state veto over a federal law was the tariff, another exciting word. But it was really about abolition. It was about slavery, and it was about power. South Carolina wanted to establish the precedent that if Washington tried to abolish slavery, they could nullify that within their state because they had nullified this revenue bill. Jackson, though an unrepentant slaveholder, cherished the Union above all. And again, I think partly because it was his family. And he desperately wanted to keep the Union together. He fought a fascinating two-level war. He's seen as a hothead. He tried to attack his own assassin. He had 2 bullets in him. He fought about 13 duels. He was in a frontier gunfight once, and afterward he bled through 2 mattresses, and they tried to cut off his arm, and he said, "I'll keep the arm," and the doctor was scared of him. So, and what he would do with the other arm, even if he took off that one. There's a lot of reason to believe that Andrew Jackson is kind of a crazy man. But he used that craziness. He was crazy like a fox. He understood that his public image was one of a wild man of the Southwest. And so he used it. Once during the battle over the Bank of the United States, a delegation came into his office to beg him to do something, and he started ranting and raving and pounding the desk, and they scurried out. And he immediately turned to an aide and said, "Didn't I manage them well?" He understood that the theatricality of power, which is hugely important. And the Union, the battle over the Union, was a similar thing where he said, "I expect a civil war of extermination soon to commence. I will hang the first nullifier I can get my hands on. I will lead the troops into South Carolina if I have to." All the while, with his other hand, he is putting in motion a compromise bill that will resolve the crisis. It gave us another 28 years to form what Lincoln would later call the mystic chords of memory. And if we had had a more significant break, I think, 30 years earlier, it would have been harder to keep the Union together. I want to read you one thing from Jackson's proclamation to the people of South Carolina in 1832. This is a document that Abraham Lincoln sent for a copy of when he was writing his first inaugural address in the winter of 1860-61. But this is what Jackson said to South Carolina on the 10th of December, 1832. Listen, if you would, to the language. It has a lot to do with how you all spend your days, and it's remarkably contemporary, I think. He says, "Contemplate the condition of that country of which you still form an important part. Consider its government, uniting in one bond of common interest and general protection so many different states, giving to all their inhabitants the proud title of American citizen, protecting their commerce, securing their literature and their arts, facilitating their intercommunication, defending their frontiers, and making their name respected in the remotest parts of the earth. Consider the extent of its territory, its increasing and happy population, its advance in arts which render life agreeable, and the sciences which elevate the mind. See education spreading the lights of religion, morality, and general information into every cottage in the wide extent of our territories and states."
I find the language quite relevant to how America has spent its days when we've been at our best. And his ultimate, I think, as I say, rescue of the Union stands as one of his 2 greatest achievements. The other is one that, again, is unfolding even now. I don't know what the market's doing right now, but he created the Democratic Party in the sense that he believed that concentrated wealth and concentrated power, unless he was the one wielding concentrated power, which tends to happen, were ultimately bad for the country. He was obsessed with, and they were all men and they were all white, and so that's important to note. But his was an important stage in the expansion of liberty and the expansion of political power to the people he called farmers, mechanics, and laborers. The first 6 presidents of the United States were good and noble men, but they were of a certain colonial elite. Jackson was not. Jackson was truly self-made. He truly propelled himself out of nowhere to ultimately to take power. And his sense was that the founders had built a republic and not a democracy, which is true. The founders had a vision of the country in mind in which the people played a very prescribed role. They were, not to torture the metaphor too much, but they were in the audience when Jackson wanted to take them and put them at center stage. And before Jackson, it was possible to talk about politics and government in this country without reference to what the majority might want. After him, it was impossible. The text, in many ways, of modern populism that even now shapes us came in, and again, this is a phrase that I know will excite you, the bank veto message of 1832, when he laid out what sounds like Franklin Roosevelt in the New Deal, sounds like Lyndon Johnson in the Great Society. Don't know yet if it sounds like Barack Obama and whatever we're going to have shortly. But this is what Jackson said in 1832. It is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes. When the laws undertake to add artificial distinctions, to grant titles, gratuities, and exclusive privileges, to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, the humble members of society, the farmers, mechanics, and laborers, who have neither the time nor the means of securing like favors to themselves, have a right to complain of the injustice of their government. There are no necessary evils in government. Its evils exist only in its abuses. If it would confine itself to equal protection, and as heaven does the rains, shower its favors alike on the high and the low, the rich and the poor, it would be an unqualified blessing. But it didn't shower those favors on the rich and the poor alike. And so Jackson wanted to be the force who leveled the playing field and made it possible for the people to have more of a fighting chance to rise, to prosper, to live their lives in a way that was not dictated by an elite that was somehow or another beyond accountability. And while there are any number of problems and nuances with that, it was Jackson who put that conversation into motion in American life. And it's something, again, when we talk about bailouts, when we talk about financial meltdowns, it's very much part of the Jacksonian conversation that continues on. Now the dark side. Jackson, as I said, was a slaveholder. He thwarted the forces of abolition. He believed that the founders' compromise when the Constitution enshrined slavery was a compromise that should not be messed with. When it came, as William Lloyd Garrison and others, the Liberator was founded in the age of Jackson. When they began, the abolitionists began serious agitation. He did what he could to stop it, particularly when it involved sending tracts down south. He believed it encouraged slave rebellion. There's nothing to excuse his views on this. There's some explanation. People feared, it's hard to imagine this now, but in the 1830s, people feared abolition as a great unknown. Even significant portions of the North believed that the compromise struck in Philadelphia should be maintained. The removal of the Native Americans, and I grew up in Tennessee, sort of halfway, but not quite halfway, but about 600 yards away from Braxton Bragg's headquarters, which is how Sherman got to Atlanta, and Chief John Ross's house, the head of the Cherokee Nation, was about 2 miles down the road. So these twin tragedies are very real to me. The American government's treatment of Native Americans is one of the two darkest, saddest sagas in American life. We consistently broke our word. We consistently broke treaties. We consistently allowed greed to triumph over any kind of moral concern. And Andrew Jackson was at the extreme edge of the mainstream, but within the mainstream of political thought and action on these questions in his time. There were three things in his head, factors going on that pushed him to remove the Indians from east to west of the Mississippi. One was pure greed. Not much more to say about that. Huge millions of acres. Jackson and other whites wanted that land, and so they took it. The other was national security. Jackson genuinely believed that Indians were potential allies and guerrilla warriors for imperial powers who might come back and undertake adventures on the continental mainland. And the third, which is reprehensible, but which we have to address because it was in his head, is the paternalistic drama that Jackson was playing out. He believed at some level that he was the great white father and that he was trying to save the tribes from the deprivations of the white man. Now, the fact that he was being more depraved than anyone could have been on the ground seems not to have complicated that self-justification in his head, but it was something that he told himself. My view of the slavery question and the Indian removal question is that we can condemn broadly and move on if we like in terms of our history. I think that amounts to a kind of unilateral disarmament in terms of learning the lessons that we can learn from the past. Arthur Schlesinger used to say that self-righteousness in retrospect is easy, also cheap. And I think there's a lot to that. My argument is that because Jackson represents the best of us and the worst of us, that we have to engage him, we have to understand him, because there are any number of questions, I am sure. I have a 6-year-old, a 4-year-old, and an 8-month-old. I am sure that at some point they're going to look at me and say, exactly why was it that you didn't think health coverage was a basic right? Exactly what were you thinking when you were living in an era when Darfur was unfolding? Any number of issues. The point of revisiting the past, I think, is to make ourselves more aware of the moral failings of our own time so that we can do something about them. To condemn in a clinical way makes us feel good, and we can feel sort of better about ourselves. But there are any number of causes awaiting our discovery and our devotion in real time. And then I think that that's the important lesson from Jackson's life. He was an inspiration to the strongest presidents who followed him. Lincoln, who had been mostly a Henry Clay man, as I said, sent for his proclamation to South Carolina. His first inaugural owes a good bit to Jackson's proclamation to South Carolina. Theodore Roosevelt said that no man except for Washington and Lincoln had left a deeper mark on American history. FDR was so obsessed. He had kind of a man crush on Jackson. He actually had his inaugural stand in 1937 on Pennsylvania Avenue built as a replica of the Hermitage, Jackson's house in Tennessee, and used Jackson's example as a way of arguing that he was a modern-day Jackson fighting the forces of concentrated wealth and trying to recover what he called a rugged and courageous spirit to fight our enemies as World War II approached. And Truman, who, as you all know, was the co-owner of what must be the most famous failed haberdashery in Western history. Eddie Jacobson, his partner in this the famous failed haberdashery, which presumably, if it had worked, we then wouldn't have won the Cold War. So it's a complicated thing to play out. Truman said that Jackson looked after the little fella who had no pull, and that's what a president is supposed to do. Truman also deplored what Jackson had done with the Indians. To my mind, the chief thing to remember about this man is, as flawed and dark as he could be, he managed to keep the possibility of progress alive. And without preserving the Union, at the moment he preserved it, we very well could have collapsed. Republics rose and fell in those days quite rapidly. For those who doubt that, I refer you to France, just to start there. we are still his children in many, many ways, and that's both for good and for ill, and something we, I think, should remember. I want to leave you with this. George Bancroft, the historian statesman, was a eulogist for Jackson in 1845 when the old man died finally. Jackson was one of those great hypochondriacs who lived forever, lived to be 78 years old. Bancroft said this about Jackson, alluding directly to the crisis with South Carolina. He said, "The moral of the great events of those days with South Carolina is this, that the people can discern right and will make their way to a knowledge of right, that the whole human mind, and therefore with it the mind of the nation, has a continuous, ever-improving existence, and the appeal from the unjust legislation of today must be made quietly, earnestly, perseveringly, to the more enlightened collective reason of tomorrow. That submission is due to the popular will and the confidence that the people, when in error, will amend their doings. That in a popular government, injustice is neither to be established by force nor to be resisted by force. In a word, that the Union, which is constituted by consent, must be preserved by love." And I think that's a love that should sustain us still. Thank you all very much. Do you want to do some questions, if you have anything? Nullification, something exciting?
Old Hickory? Where's that name, where's the label come from?
It comes from the War of 1812. He was a devoted commander to his men. They had gone down headed toward New Orleans to fight. They'd gotten called back. A lot of men were sick, a lot of men were dying. The doctor, who had the wonderful Hollywood name of Samuel Hogg, Dr. Hogg said, "Well, what are we going to do with everyone? The wagons are full, we don't have enough time, we don't have enough room." Jackson said, we're not to leave a man behind. And he gave his horse over to someone who was sick and basically walked from Louisiana to Tennessee. And Jackson was 6'1" and 140 pounds. I mean, this was a rail-thin man. Partly it was, he couldn't keep any food down because of the various bullets and knives and things in him. He could not have gone through, he would have had to remove far more than his shoes at the airport. But he was seen as tough as an old hickory branch. And that actually, the hickory as an image became one of the first great popular political images. And Obama is, in many ways, a direct descendant of that political culture. When Jackson didn't like the coverage he was getting in the newspapers, he founded his own. So it's basically like starting your own website in those days. Now, it seems hopelessly slow and all that, but if newspapers were the fastest thing you'd ever known, that was pretty fast. He built an organization through hickory clubs, through torchlight parades, through barbecue. The modern Democratic Party was built on pulled pork in many ways. He understood that politics had to be entertainment and that people wanted to be part of a political narrative. They didn't just want to be called on to vote every 4 years. They wanted to get emails from Barack or Andy or whomever. And leadership in a democratic culture really began with Jackson, and partly because American democracy began with him. And I think we're still seeing with the Obama branding strategy a good bit of what we saw with Jackson himself.
So tell me about the duels.
The duels are great, yeah. The duels are this is kind of like John Adams with sex and gunfights, you know. He fought about 13, we think. God knows how many he started. They were, as you all may know, very complicated codes of honor, and you had to have a second, and then you had to go out of state. It was all hopelessly complicated. But basically, he was perhaps the touchiest man to ever be president of the United States, and that is saying something when you think about the 43, 44 guys who've done this. Because of his family background, I think, he was particularly insecure about his place in the world. And a duel was the most immediate and dramatic way to establish one's credentials, one's standing. So if you felt insulted, if you felt as though someone had questioned you, the thing to do was to answer with physical courage. And Jackson, for all his faults, was one of the most physically courageous men who's ever been president. We've lost, to some extent, the heritage of physical bravery in our politics, although Sean Wilentz, the wonderful Princeton historian, did a piece in the New Republic years ago now about the people in our public life who bear the scars of physical bravery. And in those days, it was Bob Kerrey, it was Max Cleland, it was Bob Dole, and John Lewis from his work in the Civil Rights Movement. And Jackson was like that. He bore scars from both combat and from the duels. One of the bullets came from the first big duel, which was over his wife, and the other bullet that was in him for a long, long time was from a gunfight he had with the Benton brothers, Thomas Hart Benton and his brother Jesse. Thomas Hart Benton later became Jackson's closest ally in the Senate after their brawl. So that was change he believed in. Anything else? Hey.
One more quick question.
Oh.
Do you use Google for your research?
Did I use Google? I used Google. One of the things that was fascinating to me about the last 2 books ago I published in 2003 is a book about Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. The number of number of document collections, manuscript collections that are now online in total, or at least finding aids, from 2003 to just about 05 or so, was astronomical, the rise in the number of things. So I could find out where something was more quickly than I could have two books ago. So yes, I did. I'm a big believer in, because I'm a journalist, and this is great fun for me. This is sort of, I don't want to say it's relaxation, because that makes me seem even weirder perhaps than I am, but doing these books is just fun for me. But I do feel a burden to try to break news, to try to add papers to the record. And so what I found is that almost every presidential family has a box somewhere that their crazy aunt kept and that they don't think is important anymore, but always has a little bit of something in it. And so I spend a lot of time on documentary research like that. But in terms of the established collections, absolutely, sure did.
We all learned something of Roger Taney from the Dred Scott case,
Yeah.
right? But in Jack's administration, some historians think he was one of the key figures in sort of the separation of powers concepts and other influences. Could you talk a little bit about what influence you felt Taney had on
Sure.
Jackson?
Sure. Roger Brooke Taney of Maryland. He was an old Federalist who had become enamored, I think is a good way of putting it, enamored of Jackson from afar. He was someone that Taney first encountered Jackson as an image in the way most of us encounter politicians, and he became very intrigued by him. He was a key figure in the bank veto. His manuscript on the bank war is one of the great documents we have. It was lost to historians for about 80 years. One of these great stories. Taney had written a memoir of the war against the bank. It had been in a box that went to the garage sale. They just ultimately, it was literally found in some collector's cedar chest in Atlanta when they were selling the chest. So he was very important in both framing the arguments for the destruction of the Bank of the United States and in the removal of the deposits, which really killed it, which was one of the first great fights over federal power. He was a good Jacksonian in the broad populist sense. Dred Scott he is rightly, I think, forever in infamy for that. But in the 1830s, he was a interesting democratic, both uppercase D and lowercase d figure.
I'm curious, on election eve, one of the CNN commentators made an interesting observation that I hadn't realized, which is that the last 7 or 8, I think it was, presidential candidates that were war heroes did not get elected. Yeah. And I'm Dole, Kerry, McCain, a few recent examples. I'm curious, having done all this research on Jackson, whether you have any observations that pertain to that. I mean, I'm curious if it was simply the case that, being a war hero, was it simply the perception in those days that made you more qualified to be president, or was there actually a better qualification at that point, or is this just, the whims of public perception?
That's a great question. I think the answer in Jackson's case is that, aside from General Washington, Jackson was the most famous man in America of his time because of the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, a battle he won after the war was over, but details. We didn't know it. He kept a portrait painter in the White House. He understood image. He understood that he had to get his face around. They wrote songs about him. January 8th, the anniversary of the battle, used to be essentially a national holiday. There were Jackson parades and banquets and went on for years and years and years and years. So to some extent, Jackson was as much celebrity as military hero. Of the first, 8, 9, 10 presidents, you could only really say 2 were war heroes, Washington and Jackson. You'd have to go all the way to the Mexican War crew, the rightly forgotten presidents there. So I think I guess my instinctive answer on most things is your last point, which is that it's about whims, that economics and foreign policy and history are always, to some extent, about putting a frame on disparate events retrospectively. But economists, of course, I'm sure disagree. But celebrity was the key thing. And the one quick other Obama point I would make is Jackson understood the politics of personality in the way Obama does. Cast your mind quickly back to Grant Park to election night, when he came out with the girls, came out with Mrs. Obama, and then gave the speech by himself. I ask you, think about it for a bit. Can you remember any other president-elect or even defeated presidential candidate who ever gave a speech without someone behind him or beside him? I can't. To some extent, it's about the Obama brand. And he was there by himself accepting this. And it's fascinating. I don't think anyone else has ever had an office of the president-elect signage. I mean, this guy makes Coca-Cola look like a small, poorly thought out product line. So I think he's brilliant. I think it's just absolutely brilliant. And the Obama brand story is one that we're working on too. But it's one of the great marketing triumphs ever. And I don't mean that without substance, but just in pure political terms. But Jackson understood that. And he was the first guy who really made constant public appearances. He'd go on public tour, and people would, he was always stunned at, and I think it was genuine. He was always slightly surprised by the level of adulation. We sometimes forget, presidents can be obviously self-absorbed at Shakespearean levels, but there's also that interesting insecurity that they all have, and Jackson certainly had it. So I think But the last war hero we had as president was Eisenhower, right? Kennedy sort of counts. He was a war hero according to the book, so. Sorry? George Herbert Walker Bush is exactly right. That's right. He was the youngest fighter pilot in the Navy. And one of the it's interesting, I love George Herbert Walker Bush, and I just skipped over him in my mind there. He's a fascinating figure because everything for which he was defeated in 1992 has now turned out to be right. If you think about it, the 1990 budget deal, not going to Baghdad, and building a policy of containment around Saddam to keep him from getting weapons of mass destruction, all worked. So, yes, ma'am.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the development of executive power under Jackson and how that might be a seed that kind of reverberates into the way the office of the president is now.
Sure. Jackson was the first imperial president. I mean, there's no doubt about that. He was the first president to assert that he was the direct representative of the American people. He wanted to abolish the Electoral College. He did not think that there should be any intermediary between the president and the people. He believed he should fire cabinet members if he didn't like them. He saw the drama of American government as much more centered in the White House than any previous president had done. Jefferson had tiptoed up to it. The Louisiana Purchase was not an act of a modest executive, but Jackson did it consistently and thoroughly. There's no doubt that the presidents whom we believe have abused executive power are also Jackson's heirs. Nixon, President Bush, in many people's eyes, the current President Bush. The problem with a blanket, this goes to the whims of public perception to some extent, the problem with a blanket condemnation of executive power is one person's imperial president is another person's champion of the common person using executive power to strike down evil forces. TR used it to build the progressive era. FDR used it to build the New Deal. Truman used it to build the Fair Deal. Lincoln used it to win the Civil War. These are examples of the uses and sometimes the abuses of the powers that Jackson honed. But there's no doubt that he was the primary architect of the conception of a powerful executive that we're still living with. And one of the things that I'm going to be fascinated by is to see how President Obama does in actually rolling back the powers of the presidency. There are not many examples in human history of people giving up power once they have it. It's why we remember Cincinnatus. It's why we remember Washington leaving after 2 terms. And one of the things I think we've seen with Obama in the past couple of days and weeks is he's governing from the center, and he's a very pragmatic man. And there may be powers that President Bush exerted and honed that Obama might find useful. So it'll be interesting to see. This is all about shoes and feet and where they fit. So that's it. Thank you all so much. I appreciate it.